Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning is about Ethan Hunt and his IMF team that are continuing to search for the terrifying AI known as the Entity, but with new allies that are joining the force, they must race against time before the world as they know it changes forever. Welcome Cinema, where we focus on the film. I'm Josh, this is Simply Cinema. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. Was it good, was it bad, or somewhere right in the middle? Or if you're waiting for this review to decide if you're going to see it or not, and taking it right into a positive. Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning is an action piece that's really visceral in the adrenaline that pours into your veins. It's inducing to the fact that we're really taking this as the final entry of the Mission Impossible franchise, at least as most things lead you on to believe, and the management of all these different characters, taking this as a sequel to Dead Reckoning Part 1 is something that's great and really builds upon all the characters, and also tackles this as a final film in the entry based on all the memories and flashbacks that bleed on throughout the film, going about some great editing that it doesn't feel it's wasting your time showing you these flashbacks because of all the management of pouring it over the dialogue that's happening in present day. And this film all takes place within a 4-day span of time, and that's just really great for the management of where it actually takes everything as a whole, tackling Tom Cruise into this action star performance that shows he's still a star. There's not necessarily anything fantastic about certain performances throughout, but that's where Mission Impossible continues to be a persistent franchise that is consistent with its management of all the action set pieces being bigger and grander in its own way. This is almost a maximalist film where if you expect it to happen, it will go all out with certain aspects, the plane flying, certain aspects of the submarine dive. Those are two different aspects of the film, scenes that take place over most of the film of where you're taking those. Two great scenes with many other scenes that still combat against those two main scenes, but the way you're extending these long one-shot takes, running across the building, running on a street chase, doing different car chases and all that stuff is something you expect, but it's still delivered in an effective manner, with Christopher McQuarrie showing that he truly had a plan. All the team behind the camera is showing that it really pulls off something big and grand. Whether you end up really enjoying it or not, there's something that's really fantastic about the way that they tackle all this big projects, tackle the stunts, which are incredible. If there was still Oscar for what we're getting out of the stunts, which won't happen until 2027, this for sure would likely be winning for this year's Oscars, because it's just so visceral in the way you're just taking in and making it feel so believable, everything looking real, because most of it is real in the sense of hanging off a plane, doing all these different things that Tom Cruise is just all in for. And what you get out of all the supporting characters, there's emotional strides that really takes a toll on what you're getting, not outside of just the action pieces alone, but the adrenaline you get within the characters you know and love, different flashback that ties into past characters, and how they bring in certain aspects of those characters into this one is something neat and important without giving spoilers for what it's all going after. There's something that's very neat about how they draw in past characters and ideas that happened so long ago that weren't necessarily planned because of all the writing. Certain things where you can't necessarily predict this to go all the way to the 8th film, but being able to tie those events, certain unanswered questions that don't feel incomplete when you watch those old movies on their own, they provide something more of substance within this film that really tackles this film as a film that encapsulates a franchise as a whole, that that's why I lead this to believe it is likely the final entry of the franchise based on all those variables, certain aspects of what you're taking in these characters for. And of course, we're getting some great emotional strides with Benji and Luther, and how we're getting in other characters that were just recently introduced within the previous film, the lies and deception, certain characters turning or needing to trust each other in any other way is something that goes about in a manner that you can follow along quite a bit. It's quite full of dialogue, but it's packed to the brim with something that's great with the substance, how it dives into this espionage thriller, these different action MacGuffins of the key or other pieces of the puzzle that makes this film lead the plot forward, and that doesn't necessarily sacrifice any of the means of the runtime that's going about. Even if it's drawn out dialogue, certain aspects, it doesn't feel like it's wasting your time for the mannerisms that, if you're really able to follow along with everything that's going on, understand the stakes of the world at hand, it may be over the top in some ridiculous manner, but that's also the stakes that you're going into this Mission Impossible franchise for, and it can be a lot more fun and adrenaline inducing because of that. While there's not anything that really subverts your expectations, leads you off on a rabbit trail to somewhere completely different from where you expect, there are these small nuances to what the film has to offer that can throw you off guard, because still experiencing the film as a whole, especially in this theatrical experience, it's just big in the explosions that it tackles as a whole. There is some aspects where it stretches the PG-13 rating just a little bit, but maintains the consistent feel that the franchise gives outside of the down-to-earth, rounded film that the very first film is taken on. And so this is something that still it manages to expand upon while still maintaining a consistent feeling that you expect out of especially the later films that Christopher McQuarrie were in charge of crafting this for where it's going. And you can tell the cast is just having a lot of fun going about all these different things they're doing with the set pieces, with the designs, making the span of this film feel like it's well worth the nearly 3 hour runtime, and having the scope of the set design be something where you're taken to all these different places. There's different strides into exposition that take a little bit of time to really play out, but after that, it's really the editing, even within the first act and the second and the third, that really goes at a pretty quick pace for the management of, if you're really trying to follow along and paying attention to what this film really has to offer, it's quite wise with the management of where it takes everything from the past Mission Impossible films, but still encapsulating it as a sequel to the seventh film just as well. So there's so many mannerisms to what we get out of that, plus the villains just as well. They don't fully have as big a role in the way you might expect, without this sort of leading you in the direction that will spoil the film, but there's something that's still great and snarky about what we get out of the leads, a betrayal of what we get in the aftermath and the end of Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. So there's something that's really built upon itself in a great and fantastic manner. Then elements that really bleeds force into what you don't necessarily see in between the scenes, but it's very self-explanatory and pretty easy to follow certain aspects of what the quotes are all doing, which leads you into some elements that are really sentimental, the life themes that really bleeds on throughout some of these characters, the idea that this is likely the final film. So there's a lot to unpack with Tom Cruise and Ethan Hunt, sending him off in one of the best ways possible because of all, not only the action, but the characterization of him as a whole. That may not be the most complex character because it's all leading into this action-based franchise that's doing all the parts that it needs to in order to take its own strides by what it's tackling as a whole. But that doesn't sacrifice anything that, looking at him as a character, he still feels like one you're compelled to enjoy because of everything that's done within the action parts, the writing aspects of what this film and all the other films that came before bleed on to offer this film as a whole. But another positive, I of course have to talk about what we're getting out of the submarine and the plane chase, just the hanging off the plane, the stunts, all that go on throughout the submarine, all the different materials or set designs, the way it all plans out, and certain things you don't expect to happen will fall out to be something bigger to how they're designing all of that, that becomes more complex, that I could talk about more and more, and maybe I will explain it in a longer review, that the stance of everything that's playing on throughout just does so much for the intensity of the nature of those two climactic scenes that builds upon the stature of what you got in the design of the film, not only within the play of the action, but also how everything pans out as a whole, the nature of Ethan Hunt's character, who he is, the management to get through all these. Obviously, it's certain a thing that's a big stretch in some point if someone was doing this real life, but this is a film that you go to escape in that certain aspect that still makes it feel believable because of the reality of the situation, utilizing all these real sets and designs in order to pull this off in the greatest way possible, creating the breathless nature of what you're actually asking for this film to offer in the intensity as a whole. Which takes me into the mix elements. There's certain aspects where the MacGuffins or other aspects of the pacing that may not throw everyone into the ring of absolutely loving this. There's dialogue heavy aspects to this film that you have to pay attention to. Hopefully it will attach you because there is certain aspects that they might not be the best of the best, certain complex characters that you aren't necessarily expecting to get out of this franchise. So that's where there is a sense of this franchise is doing what it's meant to be doing. It's not necessarily bad because it's not character oriented. You're not discovering all the past, all the different emotions that go involved with some sort of mental health, other things regarding different complexities to the characters, seeing every point of their lives. So it's still something that you may have to still pay attention to, but even for my brain, what I was processing throughout, it all made sense in the general concept of where you're falling for the script. And even if you aren't as big into the script in general, there's still plenty of explosive action. Everything that's going on throughout has certain scenes competing against each other that could end up being a hit or miss based on everything that may or may not end up working for you in the actual writing itself. And one of the things I most love about this franchise that this one unfortunately doesn't tackle as much is the focus on teamwork. There is a separation between the team that they clearly have a plan that they're working together on the same place to meet at one place or one thing in the same vicinity, but Tom Cruise is off doing all of his own things as Ethan Hunt while the rest of the team are following along with where they have to meet up with him, but that doesn't always do the great chemistry together, making the characters feel less lively in one sense. And there's individual parts to certain side characters that aren't Benji, Luther, or what we're getting out of a love interest that ultimately it does pay a little bit of a sacrifice to the gravitas to where you're following along with these characters, wanting a lot more out of their teamwork. It's not necessarily a bad thing because in the end of the day, I ended up enjoying the movie and understood exactly what it's taking after, being able to tie all these things together. And they needed to be on opposite ends of the globe or different places at different times in order for make the plan work, because Ethan Hunt is too good of a character to ultimately work with the others in doing all the stunts that they wouldn't be able to do, that ultimately pulls off certain strides that can be a little bit of a throw off because you have to tackle so many aspects where they're separated. Now, it all leads into certain parts near the second and third act where they're a lot more closer together. You see the teamwork that's involved as a whole, but of course, that takes certain time to actually get to those scenes because of all the moments that you have to have Ethan Hunt doing his own individual huge action stunts, especially within the key performances within the submarine scene and also the plane chase as a whole that can be like kind of a mixed bag based on the aspects of wanting a little bit more of the characters, even if that isn't what the film was aiming for. And another complex moment that could work or not work for some, I was sort of in the middle about the flashbacks as a whole. There were quite a few that were edited well as I complimented the film for, but there's also the idea that they're leading the film on too much, speaking too much to the audience in order to play on the knowledge that they may have to remember and read out the audience what is going on after all. So that also complements certain aspects of the franchise as a whole, but there's aspects to that that can take away from when you do remember aspects of the information or recognize certain characters or things from the past. You don't always need to drive it in the force that you're obviously knowing what's all going on. And this film is being slightly inconsistent in that manner, that's ultimately showing more flashbacks than any of the other entries did, which obviously leads on to this most likely being the final entry, but it just could be a throw off to some people how it ultimately pans out for them. So that's just my personal review for Mission Impossible The Final Reckoning, which I have to rate as simply 9 out of 10. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of Mission Impossible The Final Reckoning. Was it good? Was it bad? Or somewhere right in the middle? Or if you're waiting for this review and now going to see it or not, make sure to like this video if you enjoy it, subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we talk about a love of cinema as a whole. So that's just all, and make sure to do yourself a favor and go watch a movie.